Thank you for being here. Professor is Lichtenstein, am I right?
That's good, yeah.
From the Indiana University, and his works focus on the intersection of liberal history and the struggle for racial justice in societies shaped by white supremacy, especially the US and South Africa. He is the author of several books, among them The Twice, The Work of Free Labor, Margaret Burke, White and the Dawn of Apartheid, and Marked, Unmarked, Remembered, Geography of American Memory. He is also a specialist in public history, and there is something really interesting in your presentation of on the website of the university. You say that, to be honest, I'm quoting you, at this stage in my career, I find this kind of public and community engaged work far more rewarding than writing for an academic audience. And I think that this is something really important also for us here. And maybe we can also discuss about this after your presentation. Today, you're here to talk about the racial justice in the situation in South Africa and the US, and the title of your presentation is Unsettling Memorials, Commemoration, Racial Justice in the US and South Africa. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Milovan. Good afternoon. So just before I start, who am I talking to? How good is your English? What are your interests? So good English? Good English?
I did my PhD in Nottingham, so...
Okay, good. And
I'm okay.
You're okay. And what's your PhD in, Sasha?
Slavonic studies.
Okay. But you're all interested in history and memory, right? And monuments. Okay, good.
Cool with that.
Okay, good. So, and you, how's your English? Okay, well, I just want to know how fast I can go. If I'm going too fast, stop me. I'll get carried away. Is it okay if I stand up? I'm away from
Yes,
the
of course.
So, okay, good. So, as Milovan suggested...
Okay, but you need the microphone.
Need the mic.
Yeah, the microphone.
Okay, you want to hear me? All right. So, well, first, let me thank Milovan and the Center for Public History and the Institute. It's really actually a thrill to be at the Institute. I didn't quite realize that until yesterday, that's where I'd be talking, but this place has, venerable and interesting history for me. So, and really the reason I'm in Serbia, the last few days I was up in Novi Sad meeting with some colleagues there about a project we have funded by the US State Department, so I should thank them as well, to bring a group of students from Novi Sad to the United States to do a tour of civil rights memory sites, really. They want to go to Washington and see the White House and the Congress. I sort of roll my eyes and like, no, we're going to go to Mississippi and look at the way the history of the civil rights movement and the history of racist violence have been understood and increasingly commemorated in the United States. So you all know this image, I assume, right? That's a familiar image, I think, I hope, to Serbians, or it should be, right? What? Right, Gazivestan, Kosovo Polje, right? The sort of memorial site that was, let's say, reactivated in 1989 by the famous speech by Milosevic, in which a sort of Serbian nationalist agenda was announced as being more pronounced than a socialist agenda for Milosevic anyway, and therefore for the future of the country. So, but the point of that picture and the other two in there actually, does anyone know what that is? And that is a photograph from that book by that I did on Margaret Bourke White and her photographs in South Africa. Do you guys know what that image is? No, okay, so that is what's called the Voortrekker Monument, which is the symbol that still stands today on a big hill outside of Pretoria, the capital of South Africa. That was the symbol of Afrikaner nationalism, apartheid, and white supremacy in South Africa from 1949 when it was inaugurated until today, even though the regime and the social order for which it stood has crumbled all around it and been destroyed by Nelson Mandela and the ANC. but the monument is still there, okay? That picture is from 1949, and that's the crystallizing moment. That's the Kosovo Polje moment, if you want, for apartheid and South African white nationalism. And then the other image, anyone know what that is? That's Charlottesville. That's the Robert E. Lee statue that was a rallying point during that famous or infamous march of American racists that Trump famously said, oh, they're nice people, they're good people on both sides. And the point being not necessarily that these three things are identical, but the point being that monuments might seem dead at one moment until they're brought alive or brought to life through annual rituals, through mass mobilizations in the name of a cause, whether it be apartheid, Serbian nationalism, or white nationalism in the United States. But they also become sites of daily routine, as I'll show you in a few minutes. That is, the monuments to the Confederacy, the American South, in the 1860s litter the southern landscape to this day in the United States. And for many years, they were simply part of the daily routine that people would walk past them without really thinking about them. But of course, they had a powerful symbolism, as I'll show you, for both white and black residents of places like Mississippi or Alabama or Georgia. And then finally, of course, these monuments, these sites become flashpoints of protest, right? Monuments, and this is the point of the project that I'm taking the Serbian students on, and the point of the lecture today, is that monuments are contested spaces, contested landscape, and they're contested in different ways. Sometimes they're vandalized. Sometimes they're removed or defended against removal. Or sometimes they're removed and put back, like Dzerzhinsky in front of the Lubyanka. Right? If you go look, I think someone does. Do you know about this? So I believe so. Dzerzhinsky, the founder of the Cheka, and the symbol of Soviet political repression, was removed from in front of Lubyanka prison, taken to the sculpture graveyard next to the Tretyakov in Moscow, with paint splashed on him when there was a protest. But I've been told, I haven't been back in Moscow, but I've been told that that's been put back in front of Lubyanka. I don't know if anyone knows whether that's the case or not. But so monuments can be removed, they can be restored. There can be spaces that deserve to be marked, but that have been left silent. It's another example of monuments that are not there. That's what the book that Milovan referred to, Marked, Unmarked, Remembered, that I did with my brother, who's a photographer, deals with monuments that are not there, absences rather than presences. Monuments sometimes call up, and I'll show you some nice examples of this, counter monuments, counter memorials, even sometimes in the very same space. Or sometimes monuments can be co-opted, reappropriated to tell a different story or a different narrative. So I'm going to show you some of the examples of those dynamics in the two places that I know best, although I've spent time in Berlin, for example, which is, what do I call, Berlin has the memory industrial complex par excellence. I've been to Israel and Yad Vashem. That's a pretty profound memorial space in some troubling ways to me anyway. And everywhere I go, I tend to sort of say to myself, well, let me see the monument. So when I was in Novi Sad, the last 3 days, I went to the anti-fascist monument on the riverbank there, and I also went to the top of Fruška Gora and saw the partisan monument there. I didn't have time to incorporate those into my slideshow, but the places I know best are the American South and South Africa. In South Africa, what I find most fascinating is the way that the history of apartheid and the struggle against apartheid has been commemorated, even without always displacing the previous monuments like that one, which still stands on a hill outside Pretoria and is not derelict, is not left alone, but is lovingly kept by Afrikaner nationalists to this day. Last time I was there, it was quite amazing. There was a huge group of school children going into it, all black. So black school children still go to this spot to learn about the history of South Africa, which is quite remarkable. And in the American South, of course, as I'll show you, there's a long tradition of commemoration of white supremacy attached to the idea that the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, the war fought in the name of Southern independence and pro-slavery, although people will deny that today, that war threw out an enormous, the entire memorial culture of the American South for 100 years, and even today, was based on that war and the memorialization in a positive way of the traitors, right? The people who actually seceded from the Union, who fought against the idea of a United States and insisted that their nation, which rested on slavery, was preferable to the ideals of someone like Abraham Lincoln. And they were the losing side in that war, but as many people say, they won the peace. And in winning the peace, Southern whites were able to glorify the Confederate flag and put their monuments all over the landscape. And I'll show you where, because where monuments are matter as well. But what's exciting and interesting to me, and what I'm going to show the Serbians when they come to the United States next year, is that that is finally being displaced, sometimes removed, and a new memorial culture, one that commemorates the history of the civil rights movement, the struggle for racial justice, and or the history of racist atrocities. That new memorial culture is beginning to displace the old memorial culture of white supremacy. Slowly, painfully often, but it's beginning to change the memorial landscape in the American South. So I'll try and explain to you how that is coming about. Okay, this is good. So that, of course, is the Voortrekker Monument. The symbolism actually is quite significant. It began, actually it's really interesting. So the cornerstone of this monument, as you all know, June 28, 1389, June 28, 1989, dates matter, all right? So the Voortrekker Monument cornerstone was laid on December 16th, 1938, which was the moment at which Afrikaner nationalists, reenacted what was called the Great Trek, the central moment in South African white history in which Dutch-speaking people moved into the frontier to get away from British imperialism and moved into this region of South Africa, what's called the Transvaal. And so they reenacted that on the centenary, on the 100th anniversary of 1838, December 16th, a date I'll explain in a minute. 1938 is when they laid the cornerstone, and then on December 16th, 1949, it took them 11 years to build this atrocity, okay? A bit like, probably if there's a similar building anywhere, it would be the Franco's thing in Spain, right, to represent the power of Franco's Spain. It took them 11 years to build it, and it's inaugurated on December 16th, 1949. And every December 16th to this day, Afrikaner nationalists gather for a holiday and a celebration of their culture at this site, even though now they're living in a black-ruled South Africa. The other thing about this, and I'll explain this a little bit more in a minute, is the structure of it with this ring of ox wagons. That's called the lager in South African white, in Afrikaner, in Afrikaans. The lager is the defensive perimeter that surrounds Afrikanerdom, made up of circled wagons, which harkens back to December 16th, 1838, when a lager was built to defend themselves against a mass attack of Zulu, of Africans, whose land, of course, they were on. So the lager is symbolically absolutely central to the Afrikaner mindset, all right, which is we're surrounded, we're defenseless against the natives, no one is coming to our aid, but if we pray to God, we will prevail. Right? I'm sure there is a similar Serbian narrative. I'm sure there is. Okay. Now, on the opposite hill from the Voortrekker Monument, this is right outside the capital, on top of a hill. It'll be as if it's sort of a Kinta Fruska Gora looking down on Novi Sad. This is a hill outside of Pretoria. On the opposite hill, you have what's called Freedom Park. This was built by the post-apartheid government and by the ANC. Instead of tearing down the Voortrekker Monument, which would have been quite a difficult task, or using a lot of extra explosives from the armed struggle to blow the damn thing up, some people think they should have done that, they decided to build a counter-monument to African nationalism and to what's called in South Africa the struggle. So that's one strategy, I would say, is to try to negate the other monument with a new monument. Right? They have a museum, and they have a wall to all the people who died in the armed struggle, and they have, you know, places to pray to the ancestors, and so forth and so on. So it's a good example of competing narratives embedded in monuments. Oh, yeah, so let me take you inside the Voortrekker Monument for a minute. So you can see there, that's the inaugural photograph. That's 250,000 people. That is maybe a quarter of the Afrikaans-speaking population in 1949. So Milosevic only should have dreamed that he had this many people in Kosovo Polje in 1989. Okay, but inside the Voortrekker Monument is a set of panels of marble, friezes, right, illustrating the history of the Great Trek and illustrating the encounter of Afrikaners with their African antagonists. All right. Now, although the moment in which they circled the wagons and miraculously, and it is presented as a miracle, miraculously defeated the Zulu army in 1838, was preceded by a series of defeats at the hands of the Zulu. Defeats, of course, that were the function of treachery, right? Savagery, and the murdering of women and children as depicted here. Okay, right? So those are the Zulu king's warriors who pretend that they're going to sign a treaty with the Afrikaners only to jump them and betray them and murder their women and children. Again, I'm sure that, you know, every nationalist movement often draws on a similar set of myths. Finally, another competing set of narratives. This is the battlefield of Blood River, which is where that famous 1838 battle in which the Afrikaners prevailed because of a miracle, as they see it, was fought. This is the actual battlefield out in the middle of nowhere in KwaZulu-Natal in southeastern South Africa. I should have put it on a map. And there are two historic sites here. One is not a government site. It's a privately designed and maintained site to commemorate what the Afrikaners call the Battle of Blood River, December 16th, 1838. December 16th now in South Africa is a national holiday known as Reconciliation Day. Okay? The idea that what once was the symbol of a white nationalism now can somehow be co-opted and turned into a symbol of the Rainbow Nation and South African post-apartheid unity, right? Here you can see the lager. This is where there actually was a lager built the night of December 16th, 1838. They've recreated it, right, and rebuilt it. And every December 16th, I've not been, and I don't know if I want to go, there's a massive, picnic of Afrikaners who come out here to the countryside and sit around and do their barbecue. And it's another society that loves to eat meat, like the American South, like y'all. as they would say in the American South. But the government has put up a counter monument right on the other side of the river, which tells the narrative of the Battle of Blood River from the Zulu perspective. And that's here. And so it's a really interesting site because you get the two narratives commemorated and memorialized. And I forgot to put a picture of it, but the joke, the cruel joke is that there is a bridge built, a pedestrian bridge that crosses Blood River so you can walk from one monument to the other. It's called Reconciliation Bridge, and it's always locked, and you have to drive around. You can't actually walk across the pedestrian bridge. So, but again, an example of kind of counter memorials sharing really the same space. And finally, one more interesting memorial in South Africa that I recently visited, or I haven't been there since 2019, but that I visited in 2019, the Women's Monument, and the narrative of women and children who, and one of the things that's really important to understand about any of these sort of nationalisms of defeat and resentment, right? Nationalisms of resentment, I think you could call them. The American South, South African white nationalism, and with all due respect, I think Serbian nationalism shares some of these qualities, right? Kosovo Polje, after all, was a defeat, right, or not? Yeah.
It is perceived as a defeat.
Right. That's exactly. That's right.
The real historical truth is
No, the real historical truth, as you know, doesn't matter with these monuments usually, right? Okay, so it's perceived as a defeat. It's a point of both pride and resentment simultaneously, I think you could say. So this monument is to the Afrikaner women and children who were locked up in concentration camps by the British Empire during the South African War, 1899 to 1902. So Afrikaner nationalism is a white nationalism, to be sure, and it's sometimes directed at Africans, but it's just as often directed at the British Empire. And this is the point of crucial resentment against the British Empire, where the starving to death of women and children in concentration camps, locked up by Kitchener and the British Empire. And actually buried at the base of this monument, well, there are two things. Buried at the base of this monument is Emily Hobhouse, who was a British female activist who popularized and protested against the treatment of Afrikaner women and children. She's actually buried here. So they at once heroicize her, but are poking at the history of the British Empire. And here then you see the male commando waving goodbye to his wife and child as he rides off to fight the British Empire. So that gives you a sense of the Afrikaner mindset as it's still embedded in monuments across South Africa. Oh, and now, of course, there's a movement in South Africa going on to sort of reconfigure the memorial landscape and rethink it. That's what's called the Rhodes Must Fall movement, right? Which began with the effort of students at the University of Cape Town to remove the statue of Cecil Rhodes, who is the preeminent symbol, actually, of British imperialism. So I would think that maybe Afrikaner students shared some of the resentment. And Rhodes, of course, famously was the person who brought British imperialism to South Africa. So now African students, but students in general, but African students in particular, removed and insisted on the removal of the statue of Cecil Rhodes, which sits right in front, or used to, of the University of Cape Town. Okay, it was removed, and that's the Rhodes Must Fall. And the other monument is Jan van Riebeeck, who was the founder of European South Africa in 1652. So there's this ironic vandalism where people are playing on that idea that he's the one who landed and started dispossessing indigenous people of their land. Now, in the United States, there's a similar set of conflicts and contested memories going on. This is one of the most interesting ones. So do you guys know who John Brown was? Okay, right. Yes? Well, why, of course? They don't seem to know.
because his personality is
Right. So John Brown was a white man, an abolitionist who fought against slavery, and in doing so did engage in an armed uprising against slavery. So was he a terrorist or was he a freedom fighter, right, is the question. And he's commemorated in both ways, actually. Now, there is a national park at the site where his armed rebellion began, where he and a handful of followers raided an armory to get weapons and were hoping to stimulate a slave revolt all across the South. This is in 1859, right on the eve of the Civil War. So for the Confederates, for white Southerners at the time, he was the devil incarnate. And for some abolitionists, he was a hero. And for others, he was heroic in his vision, but flawed in his methods. Okay? So there are a number of, so on that site where this rebellion was sparked, it failed miserably. There's a national park site now about the history of abolitionism, the history of John Brown. It's a very good site. It's a bit like it's not a big city, but it's at the confluence of two rivers. So you can imagine it's right like where the Sava and the Danube meet. The John Brown Harpers Ferry is where the Shenandoah and the Potomac rivers meet at a point where there was an armory, a fort. Now, one of the things that really amazed me last time I went there, and I hadn't noticed it before, this is an example of overlapping memorials. There's a national park site. It's neutral on John Brown. I think it presents the abolitionist cause as just. It's anti-slavery, but John Brown is a problematic figure because of his resort to violence. But sitting in the middle of the national park is this really peculiar memorial that was put up by the Daughters of the American Confederacy in about 1920 or 1930. I forget the exact date. And I'll read it to you because it's quite bizarre. On the night of October 16th, 1859, that's John Brown's raid, Hayward Shepherd, an industrious and respected colored free man, not a slave, a free black man, was wounded by John Brown's raiders. In pursuance of his duties of an employee of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Company, this was a railroad junction, he became the first victim of the attempted insurrection. This is erected by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, that is the women who wanted to honor the dead of the Southern side in the Civil War, and the sons of Confederate veterans as a memorial to Hayward Shepherd, exemplifying the character and faithfulness of thousands of Negroes who, under many temptations, throughout subsequent years of war, and there they're referring to the Civil War, not World War I, so conducted themselves that no stain was left upon a record, which is the peculiar heritage of the American people, and an everlasting tribute to the best of both races. In other words, this stone was erected by white Southerners to celebrate the loyal Negro, as opposed to the abolitionists who joined John Brown's raid. In other words, the narrative here is to say John Brown thought he was going to spark a rebellion of enslaved people, but actually black people were not interested in his message and indeed did their duty loyally to the government at the time. It's quite an extraordinary marker, and it still stands there, presumably because it was deeded to the property by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and the national government has decided not to remove it, or maybe is not allowed to remove it, but it's not even marked with a descriptive plaque explaining what the hell it's doing there and how its message is at great odds, really, with the narrative that now is being told about the Civil War and about abolitionism, which was a narrative that black people were happy to join John Brown, and as soon as the Union troops got to slave sites in the American South, black people en masse left the plantations and ran to Union lines. This is a very different story. This is the story that white Southerners want to tell themselves, all right? Now, that photo didn't come out so well. Every December 3rd, 1859, which is the anniversary of the hanging of John Brown, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in the town where he was hung, Charleston, West Virginia, have a parade to commemorate it. This is an image from the book I did with my brother, Marked, Unmarked, Remembered. So there's different ways of remembering these events. Another good example of that, this is a spot that I'll bring the Serbian students to next year. Do you guys know anything about Emmett Till? This was an infamous murder of a young black boy, 15 years old, in Mississippi. He was visiting from Chicago, visiting relatives. He apparently whistled at a white woman. He didn't know better. That's the story. And he was kidnapped and murdered by the woman's husband and brother-in-law. And this became the spark for the civil rights movement in the South. And there are people in the town of Sumner, Mississippi, and Money, Mississippi, tiny town in Mississippi, who are trying still to commemorate this event. And they've managed to turn the courtroom where Emmett Till's murderers were tried in 1955. Everyone in town knew who they were, and they were tried by a jury of their peers, i.e. other white men, and they were acquitted, even though everyone in that courtroom knew that they had done the deed, but they were acquitted. Now the courtroom has been turned by a coalition of people in the community, black and white, into a memorial site. And so you go in there and they tell you the story of Emmett Till and they tell you the story of the acquittal, and it's a very powerful thing. And actually I took South African students there. And it's in this tiny little town, and it's in the actual courthouse. However, when you walk in, or more appropriately perhaps when you walk outside of the courthouse, this is what you still see. That's a Confederate monument. That's a monument that honors the soldiers who fought to keep Emmett Till's ancestors in Mississippi enslaved in the 1860s. It's still there. There it is during the trial in 1855. I love this image because the black people who are not allowed into the courtroom during the trial are sitting, they're using the monument. So it's really an amazing testament to the ordinariness of these memorials. And every single county courthouse across the South has one of these standing in front of it, as I'll show you in a minute. And that one was standing in front of the courthouse. So every time black people were walking into that courthouse, or white, so as Emmett Till's murderers walked into the courthouse to be tried, and as the jury walked into the courthouse to be tried, they walked past this thing that glorified their grandpappies who fought in the Civil War to preserve slavery and to subordinate black people. That is an incredible symbol. And every time black people walked past this courthouse, they could be sure that that was not a place where justice was going to be enacted for them, because it was spelled out for them on the very thing that they were sitting on that day. So to me, this is a powerful, powerful imagery of the ordinary day-to-day embeddedness of white supremacy in these small towns across the United States, even in a community that's trying to commemorate the racism that tore it apart in the 1950s. And there's a sign that was erected to the memory of Emmett Till at the spot where they believe he was thrown into the river, wrapped in barbed wire, much the way that the Jews, Romani, and Serbs were wrapped in barbed wire in Novi Sad and thrown into the Danube. But that sign was vandalized. What? By guns? Yeah, by shotguns. Shortly after it was put up. Not in 1955, in 2005, in 2015 rather. Okay, so. They grouped the bullets nicely. Yeah, right. So they took the sign down, and then the people doing the commemoration are putting it into a museum, right? To show that the racism hasn't subsided in this community. Okay, and so again, that Confederate monument in front of the Sumner County Courthouse that still stands is very, very typical. There are these monuments in every little southern town, and they're not off in the backwoods somewhere. You cannot miss them. All you do is go to the town square, or you go to the county courthouse. Right? Which one? Oh, yeah. Oops, sorry. That one is Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederate States of America, and it still stands in front of the Alabama State Capitol. Okay? So these are not, disused memorials that everyone has forgotten about. They are cherished, they are honored, they are kept up, and they stand in very, very prominent sites in most southern towns and communities to this very day. The Southern Poverty Law Center, which does a lot of this anti-racist work across the South, has counted that there are 800 of these all around. That's a lot, okay? Oh, one other important thing. They were not built in 1865, right when the Civil War ended. They were not even built in 1876, which was when the federal troops were expelled from the South or withdrawn from the South, and the period known as Reconstruction came to an end and white supremacy was reasserted. They were put up between 1900 and 1920, primarily, all right? At a moment in which there was a desire to reassert white supremacy for a new generation, the generation that had not witnessed slavery in the Civil War. And then more were put up when? In the 1950s, during the Civil Rights Movement itself, in order to demonstrate Southern resolve to not, white Southern resolve, to not bend on these issues. Here's another very interesting one. Okay, this is an event, a pretty obscure event in American history called the Colfax Massacre. Or that's at least what the abolitionists called it, or and black people have always called it. 1873, the Colfax Massacre. The state of Louisiana in the 1950s put up a historical marker. On this site occurred the Colfax riot, not a massacre, a riot, in which 3 white men and 150 Negroes were slain. That's a pretty interesting riot in terms of the body count on the two sides, isn't it? This event marked the end of carpetbag misrule in the South. So let me translate that for you. This event marked the end of Northern military authorities remaining in the South to enforce the idea that black people could no longer be enslaved. This marked the end of the promise embedded in the Civil War that it would lead to the liberation of black people. This marked the end of any effort to enact racial justice in the American South. That was something that was being celebrated in Louisiana in 1950 when this marker was put up. And then my brother, who goes around photographing these sites, discovered in a nearby cemetery that there's an additional monument to the 3 white men who died defending white supremacy. Now, this is not a public marker, it's a private marker, but there are their names. There's no place next to this monument that lists the names of the 150 black people who were murdered in this riot, which was a massacre. Right, and the marker on the back of the gravestone actually says, these 3 men died heroically in defense of white supremacy. Now, again, it's a private gravestone. They can put anything they want on it. It's a little different than a public marker, but it's pretty extraordinary. And I've been told that this marker has now been taken down. But I don't think there's a public memorial to the massacre where, again, they could put it on the river. It's on the riverbank. And it's not the Mississippi River. I think it's the Pearl River. But it's a place that's unmarked now that desperately deserves a monument. And we have, obviously there's no photograph of the massacre, but there's a very powerful, I forgot to put it up on the screen, drawing done for Harpers magazine, which was really the illustrative magazine of the 1870s, that illustrates what's happening. And they could build an amazing monument based on that. I don't know if there's a movement to do that or not. Charleston, South Carolina. I include this one because it was the site of, now it seems like a long time ago, and we've had subsequent ones, the site of a racist massacre in the Emmanuel Church. And that's the Emmanuel Church after the massacre. This is where I've lost track. I can barely name all the racist crazies in the United States who've gone on rampages and killed black people, but this is the infamous one in Charleston, and when was it? I can't even remember the date now. But Charleston also was the site of struggles over memory because you had finally the erection of a statue to Denmark Vesey, who led a slave revolt in 1822. And the creation of that statue was very, very controversial in Charleston. And the other thing that you did have happen very recently, just like 2 years ago, was this: the removal of the statue commemorating John C. Calhoun, who was the key figure in articulating a pro-slavery argument for the southern states in the 1830s, who was from Charleston, South Carolina, who was a senator, and was and is, I would say, revered by white people in the town of Charleston. The main street is still called Calhoun Street, not Vesey Street. But they did remove the statue, which was in a prominent place in the center of town. And I particularly like this image because that's the Emmanuel Church, the site of that massacre. Sorry, I forget the date. But, you know, it's recently. And that was the church that Denmark Vesey founded in the 18-teens. So there's, you know, these are places where this history is still all connected. Montgomery, Alabama is also a site that was one time the capital of the Confederacy. I showed you where Jefferson Davis still stands in front of the state capitol. Here you have a famous and really powerful civil rights memorial to all the people who were murdered during the civil rights movement, designed by Maya Lin, the woman who designed the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. But at the same time, in Montgomery, Alabama, every, what's the date? This was the 150th anniversary of the founding of the Confederacy in 1861. Okay, so, and they reenact. These are women dressed as Confederate wives. You can find very similar, actually, images in South Africa of reenactments of the Great Trek from 1838, where Afrikaner women dress up as pioneer women. So this is a reenactment. And my brother took this photograph because he found these nice ladies sitting and resting their feet during the reenactment. What are they sitting on? They are sitting on the bench that is there to mark the memory of Rosa Parks, who famously is the person who touched off the Montgomery bus boycott by refusing to go to the back of the bus on her bus. And this was the bench that she supposedly sat on when she got on that bus. But it's the butts of the Confederate memory buffs that are sitting on it when my brother was there. So again, you can make a monument, but you can't control how it's going to be used. This is a very interesting moment in which there's a famous or infamous lynching, that is racist murder in 1916 in Waco, Texas. There's the imagery there, a mob witnessing the burning and murdering of a black man. And this is the very spot where that occurred. This is the spot 100 years later. This is the descendants of the man who was lynched, looking up at the balcony where this photograph was taken, famously, of this lynching. And the mayor of the town actually apologized to the descendants of the lynched individual. Jesse Washington was his name. If any of you have seen Spike Lee's film, Black Klansman, have any of you seen that? You saw it? So, you know that scene where Harry Belafonte talks about the lynching of 1916? He narrates it very powerfully. That's this lynching, right? And they put up a marker after this, but it took 100 years for the town to apologize. But they did, and so this is a moment in which communities are actually able to reclaim memorial justice, if not actual justice. Okay, I assume all of you know what that is, right? You know what that is. Do you guys know what that is? Right, that's the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin. Anyone know what this is? It's the Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg. Okay, now I'm intruding Berlin here for a minute, and it's another place I do know the memorial landscape well because I spent a lot of time there. But as you'll see in a minute, these two memorial sites, Berlin and the Holocaust, and the Apartheid Museum, and those nooses are designed, there's one for each person who was hung by the apartheid government because of their political activities in the anti-apartheid movement. It's really, have you been there? No. It's a really amazing site where they tell the story of the struggle against apartheid very, very effectively in this museum. But the best site in the United States around these issues now, it's just opened maybe 4 years ago, I believe, is the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which is designed to commemorate all of the victims that this organization has been able to count. It's about 4,000 black people who were lynched all across the country, not just in the South, although most of them were in the South, but very famously, at least one very famous one was in my home state of Indiana. But it's very clear when you go into this place, and it's not a secret, I'm not the first person to discover this. I mean, Brian Stevenson, the man who founded this memorial site, has been explicit about it. You know, he went to Berlin, he went to Johannesburg, and he conceived of this, which I think in many ways draws on those in obvious ways. Each one of these, I don't know what to call them, steles, plinths, no one has come up with a good word. They're giant bronze things. Each one represents not a person, but a county where a lynching occurred, and it has the names engraved on them. And as you walk through, they kind of get higher and higher, as if they're a lynched body dangling from a tree. It's an extraordinary site, and like I know there are mixed feelings about this. I don't know what your feeling is about it. I think it's a pretty powerful site, but you know, how do you represent or commemorate an atrocity without displaying that atrocity? Right. You could walk through, as I did yesterday, the World War II museum in Novi Sad, and I'm sure there's one in Belgrade as well, and so it shows anti-partisan violence by the Stasi or by the Nazis, it's unclear which. And so in Novi Sad, there's a photograph of a road with partisan bodies hanging every 10 feet, almost, you know, it's gruesome. So how do you commemorate that sort of atrocity? Again, I think the one by the riverbank in Novi Sad, if you guys know that one, of the three figures standing by the riverbank, almost like Giacometti sculptures, that's a pretty powerful version. But so this does an amazing job of forcing the memory and forcing reckoning with the history of atrocity without actually physically showing the atrocity. And really, this is when I take students from Serbia to the United States next year. This is kind of our final stop, and it's really an important site. And there's some more images of it. And it is in Montgomery, standing on a hill overlooking these other sites like Jefferson Davis and the state capitol. And each of these then is supposed to be reclaimed by a local county where it will be erected as a memorial, hopefully on the courthouse next to or instead of the Confederate monument that often stands in these places. And of course, when a mob would grab a black person and murder them and hang them, they would often take them not to the backwoods, but to the county courthouse. So in a lot of these county courthouses, you can look at that Confederate monument and you can look at a tree right next to it, which was a lynching tree. And I'll end with this. And this is an example of what we might call vernacular commemoration. Again, this is a photograph taken by my brother, who's a photojournalist, and he and I did this book together. And this is a vernacular or an impromptu and informal memory site to Michael Brown, who was murdered by a police officer in St. Louis, and that did a lot to touch off the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement. I don't know whether this is still there or if a more permanent physical memorial has replaced it or not. Now, those are just some examples of counter memorials, of impromptu memorials, of contested memorials. Every single community in the South, but really across the United States, is having this argument now. How do we uproot or decolonize, in the South African terms, the memory sites that glorify or at the very least apologize for white supremacy? And how do we erect new memorials that do either one of two things, that commemorate the lives lost to racism or celebrate the lives of those who fought against it. And it's a pretty exciting moment in the history, in the public history business. And I guess that goes to what you opened with, Milovan, which is, I find this work really exciting because unlike, an academic article, which, 4 people might read, when you work on a museum exhibit or a commemorative site, you're really changing the public discourse, or you can. So, so I'll leave it at that and entertain questions. Thank you for your attention. And please introduce yourself so I have an idea who I'm talking to. I mean, I know you already did, Sasha, but you came in late, so.
Thank you so much. I did come in late. My name is Vera Mevorach. I am part of the Shoah Lab we have here, Holocaust Studies
great.
Laboratory. So I deal with Holocaust representation. So I was very interested. And also, I'm personally always been...
You're Israeli?
I have a Jewish heritage.
Okay. You sound Israeli, but
I sound Israeli.
But it's a Serbian accent? Okay.
I'm not sure if that's a compliment, but 2000. And I've also always personally been, I don't know how to call this, but with Black history, with the history of the slave movement, and so I was I'm sorry I was late. I was really inspired and moved.
Good, thank you.
I mean, I want to ask a question. I'm curious because we deal in similar topics in a sense. And for me, I always thought that, I feel that monuments and memorials are the problem.
Are the problem?
I feel they are the problem.
Okay.
That they're not the solution. And these contested memories, we find them everywhere. When you speak about the issues with the white supremacy, with racism, but we have the same things here. We have the same things right now happening in Europe. It's something. It's something that seems intrinsic to memories. But I think that commemoration also adds to this issue. I was trying to put myself in the shoes. I mean, if you can put yourself in the shoes, or those southern families, or those people, even 50 years after the fact. I feel that maybe the issue is that commemoration is is related to loss.
Is what?
It's related to loss.
To loss, yeah.
And I have a sense we will never be able to move past these contested, especially contested memorialization, these narrative battles, which are crazy, until we recognize that. I somehow have a feeling that all they actually need is not their narrative white supremacy, but the right to also. Remember, I don't know, something, I mean, it's a little bit out there, sorry for being a bit controversial. I was just inspired of thinking again about memorialization, commemorization.
So, I mean, on the one hand, I mean, I wouldn't say memorialization is the problem, but it can be a problem. And the problem would be, okay, we've erected a memorial, we're good to go. Okay. Now, Brian Stevenson, so the guy who really has done the memory work around that site in Montgomery, and which anyone going to the United States, I would strongly recommend to go to that site, even though it's off the beaten track. But, he's well aware that the memorial is not the end point. It's the starting point to initiate a discussion and a reckoning. And so, and so he doesn't say, okay, good, that's done and dusted. He says, okay, this memorial is about the history of lynching. Now let's talk about mass incarceration and the injustices in the criminal justice system today. So he's very careful to make sure that the memorial does not become the problem and that it stimulates a discussion. But that is a danger, I would think. But on the other hand, so would you say it would be better to simply have no memorials? I mean, doesn't this